Anyone caught eating her food again will answer to me. The order echoed through the Bellini mansion with such force that every conversation stopped. Capos, bodyguards, and veteran enforcers froze where they stood. Vincent Bellini rarely repeated himself. His cold eyes swept across the room. What kind of operation makes armed men sneak into a kitchen like thieves? Silence. Until one scarred veteran lowered his head. Boss, we'd rather skip meals than stop eating Mrs. Bellini's cooking. For the first time in years, the most feared mafia boss in America found himself completely speechless. The quiet, plus-size wife he had assumed couldn't even prepare dinner had somehow earned the unwavering loyalty of the hardest men in his empire. How had that happened? Nobody imagined Rose Whitmore Bellini would become invisible so quickly after her wedding. When she first stepped through the towering iron gates of the Bellini estate, she carried only 2 suitcases. One held her clothes. The other contained dozens of weathered notebooks, tied carefully with faded blue ribbons. Inside those notebooks lived generations of family recipes. Every page was covered with handwritten notes from her late grandfather. Never cook to impress people. Cook so they feel remembered. Those words had shaped her entire life. As a little girl, Rose had spent countless afternoons standing beside her grandfather in a warm country kitchen. He never measured ingredients with scales. Instead, he measured emotions. "This soup," he would say, "needs another 5 minutes because your grandmother had a difficult day. The bread isn't finished yet. People can taste whether you're rushing." Long before Rose learned sophisticated recipes, she learned something far more valuable. Food was another language, one that told people they mattered. She had carried that lesson into adulthood. She simply never imagined entering a family where no one seemed interested in hearing it. The Bellini estate looked less like a home than a fortified palace. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers. Paintings worth millions lined endless hallways. Armed guards stood at nearly every entrance. Servants moved with practiced silence. Everything functioned according to strict rules. Everything except warmth. Rose noticed it almost immediately. People greeted one another politely. No one truly smiled. Even laughter sounded cautious, as though joy required permission. When Vincent welcomed her into the mansion, he was respectful. He never raised his voice, never insulted her, never treated her cruelly. But neither did he invite her into his world. "Our marriage brings stability to both families," he explained calmly after the ceremony. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." Comfortable. Not happy. Not loved. Not needed. The distinction lingered in Rose's mind. She understood their marriage had begun as an alliance rather than a romance. She didn't expect fairy tales. She only hoped that, given enough time, they might slowly become partners. Instead, she discovered someone else already controlled every corner of the household. Vivian Moretti, Vincent's elegant aunt, manager of the Bellini estate for nearly 20 years. Vivian welcomed Rose with flawless manners. Every compliment sounded polished. Every smile stopped just short of kindness. "We already have experienced staff handling the estate," Vivian said during Rose's first morning. "So please don't concern yourself with household responsibilities." Rose nodded politely. "I'd still love to help where I can." Vivian smiled. "I'm sure you would." The conversation ended there. Over the following weeks, Rose realized every decision flowed through Vivian. Meal planning, guest receptions, holiday traditions, charitable events, even flower arrangements. Whenever Rose offered assistance, Vivian gently redirected her elsewhere. "Oh, that's already been handled. The chefs know what they're doing. The servants have instructions. There isn't anything for you to worry about." At first, Rose believed she simply needed patience. Eventually, an opportunity would come. It never did. Unknown to Rose, Vivian had quietly given another instruction. Under no circumstances was Mrs. Bellini allowed inside the main kitchens. The executive chefs obeyed immediately. When Rose wandered in one afternoon, hoping to bake cookies for the staff, the head chef nearly panicked. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Bellini. Lady Vivian has already prepared today's menu. Perhaps tomorrow." Tomorrow never arrived. The staff felt embarrassed refusing her. Yet nobody dared question Vivian's authority. Rumors soon spread through the estate. Mostly whispered. Never spoken loudly enough for Rose to confront. A woman her size probably enjoys eating more than cooking. "I heard the marriage happened because of politics. She's pleasant enough. But does she actually do anything?" The words drifted through corridors, across gardens, behind half-closed doors. Rose heard more than people realized. She simply pretended she hadn't. Years earlier, her grandfather had offered another lesson. People reveal themselves through the way they treat someone who doesn't fight back. Rose had never forgotten. So she smiled, thanked everyone, learned every employee's name, asked gardeners about their children, remembered birthdays, helped elderly housekeepers carry laundry baskets despite protests that she shouldn't. Nobody noticed those small moments. Nobody except the employees themselves. Even Vincent unintentionally reinforced the distance. One evening he found Rose reading recipes in the library. "You still enjoy cooking?" he asked. She smiled. "I always will." He looked genuinely surprised. "I assumed you wouldn't miss it much. We employ some of the finest chefs in New York." Rose closed the notebook gently. "They're excellent." "I just enjoy making meals myself." Vincent nodded politely. "Well, you shouldn't feel obligated anymore. We have professionals." He meant it as reassurance. Rose accepted it with her usual smile. But after he left, her fingers lingered on the worn leather cover of her grandfather's notebook. For the first time since childhood, she wondered if the one gift she treasured most might never again have a place in her life. The Bellini estate never truly slept. Even after midnight, security vehicles rolled through the grounds, radios crackled with coded messages, armed guards rotated posts beneath dim courtyard lights, while mechanics checked armored SUVs before dawn operations. Everyone had a role, everyone except Rose. She refused to let bitterness become a habit. Each morning she still greeted the gardeners by name. She learned which maid secretly sent half her salary to care for an aging father. She noticed the young chauffeur who always skipped breakfast because he began work before sunrise. None of these observations seemed important. To Rose, they were everything. Her grandfather had once smiled while kneading bread and said, "The first ingredient isn't flour, it's paying attention." So she paid attention. One rainy Thursday, that habit changed everything. Just after 11 o'clock that night, Rose couldn't sleep. The mansion felt unusually restless. Headlights flashed beyond her bedroom window as several black SUVs rolled through the front gates. A dangerous operation had apparently ended. She wandered downstairs, hoping to make herself a cup of tea. Passing near the service corridor, she heard quiet voices. "Kitchen's closed. Chef left hours ago. Guess the leftovers are gone too." She paused. Around the corner stood 6 Bellini soldiers. Their expensive suits were stained with mud. One man's sleeve had been hastily wrapped around a bleeding forearm. Another limped slightly. Their shoulders sagged with exhaustion. They looked nothing like the intimidating enforcers visitors feared. They looked hungry. One younger guard forced a laugh. "I'd eat cardboard at this point." Another opened the industrial refrigerator. Only a few cold containers remained. Half a tray of dry pasta, vegetables already beginning to wilt, some forgotten chicken stock. Nobody complained. Years in the organization had taught them to accept discomfort without question. Rose quietly stepped forward. "If you don't mind waiting." Every head turned. "I think I can make something." The men exchanged uncertain glances. One scratched the back of his neck. "We couldn't ask you to do that, Mrs. Bellini." "You aren't asking." She smiled gently. "I'm offering." None of them knew how to refuse kindness. The kitchen remained strangely peaceful after midnight. For the first time since entering the Bellini family, Rose stood where she had always wanted to be. Not as the Mafia Boss's wife, simply as someone preparing dinner. She rolled up her sleeves, examined every shelf. There wasn't much, but her grandfather used to joke that empty cupboards inspired the best cooks. She found onions, carrots, celery, Parmesan rinds someone had nearly thrown away, fresh herbs growing beside the back window, leftover roasted chicken, a little cream, homemade bread from that morning. Nothing expensive, nothing extraordinary, yet in Rose's hands each ingredient seemed to remember its purpose. The onions caramelized slowly until they released a sweet aroma that drifted through the silent kitchen. Butter melted. Garlic sizzled. Chicken stock simmered into something rich and comforting. She stirred patiently, tasting, adjusting, waiting, never rushing, because comfort couldn't be hurried. The guards watched from the doorway. One whispered, "She's cooking from scratch." Another frowned. At midnight, nobody had seen anything like it inside the Bellini estate. Professional chefs cooked with precision. Rose cooked with affection. There was a difference. Within 40 minutes, steaming bowls covered the long wooden counter. Creamy chicken soup, fresh herb bread toasted with garlic butter, a simple salad brightened with lemon dressing, warm apple slices sautéed with cinnamon for dessert. Rose placed the first bowl before the oldest soldier. "I noticed your wrist. You've been injured. Be careful. It's hot." The veteran stared. Not at the food, at her. Nobody had noticed his injury. Not because people were cruel, because everyone had been busy surviving. He accepted the bowl with both hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Bellini." She shook her head softly. "Please eat before it gets cold." Silence filled the kitchen. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind created when people experience something unexpected. Spoons moved slowly, then faster. No one spoke for several minutes, until the youngest guard quietly laughed. "I haven't tasted soup like this since I was 12. Another nodded. "My mother used rosemary exactly like this." Someone else smiled despite himself. "The bread, it smells like Sundays." Rose listened without interrupting. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply enjoyed watching tired faces soften. The oldest veteran finished every last spoonful, then carefully folded his napkin. His eyes looked suspiciously bright. "My wife passed away 8 years ago." He cleared his throat. "Tonight. This reminded me of eating with her." Rose reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "I'm glad she gave you beautiful memories." No grand speech, no dramatic comfort. Just understanding. The men returned to their duties carrying something none of them expected. A full stomach and a strangely lighter heart. The following evening, Rose again wandered into the kitchen after dinner. This time she wasn't surprised to find 3 familiar faces waiting awkwardly near the doorway. One scratched his neck. "We were wondering if you happened to be cooking again." Rose smiled. "I was just about to begin." The next night, 6 men appeared. Then 10. Word spread without anyone intending it to. Drivers who worked 16-hour shifts. Mechanics covered in engine grease. Gardeners finishing before sunrise. Junior capos buried beneath endless responsibilities. Bodyguards returning from dangerous assignments. They arrived quietly, never demanding, never expecting. Simply hoping. Rose never prepared extravagant feasts. She remembered preferences instead. Extra pepper for Marco, because old injuries dulled his taste. Less salt for Anthony after learning about his blood pressure. Vegetarian pasta for one accountant whose daughter had convinced him to stop eating meat. Chocolate pudding on birthdays. Apple pie when someone quietly mentioned missing home. Every detail mattered, because every person mattered. One evening, a nervous young recruit apologized. "I'm probably taking someone else's portion." Rose looked genuinely confused. "I made enough for everyone." He hesitated. "But I'm just a recruit." She handed him another slice of warm bread. "At this table, you're simply someone who's had a long day." The words traveled through the Bellini organization faster than any rumor. Not because the meals were luxurious, because someone inside the mansion finally treated rank as less important than humanity. Soon the soldiers developed their own quiet routine. After finishing assignments, they would check whether the small side kitchen light remained on. If it glowed beneath the window, Mrs. Bellini was cooking, and somehow, no matter how difficult the day had been, everything felt manageable for another night. The changes began so quietly that no one could identify the exact moment the Bellini estate started feeling different. No new rules had been announced. No meetings had been held. No speeches had been given. The only difference was that every evening, long after the mansion's formal dining room had closed, a warm light continued glowing from the small service kitchen near the east courtyard, and people kept finding reasons to pass by. At first, the gatherings remained small. 6 soldiers, then 10, then 15. Rose never invited anyone. She simply cooked enough for whoever arrived. Some nights she made hearty beef stew that simmered for hours. Other evenings she baked herb-roasted chicken with buttery mashed potatoes. On colder nights, enormous pots of tomato soup filled the kitchen with aromas that drifted through nearby hallways. The menu changed constantly. The feeling never did. No matter what appeared on the table, everyone left feeling lighter than when they arrived. Rose possessed an unusual gift. She remembered people, not just their names, their stories. When Marco entered one evening rubbing his shoulder, she quietly placed a heating pad beside his bowl before he even sat down. The old injury acting up again? Marco blinked. "I never told you that." "You did. 3 weeks ago. You thought nobody was listening." She smiled. "I was." Marco stared at her for a moment, before laughing softly. "My own doctor forgets more than you do." Another evening, the estate's youngest mechanic hesitated near the doorway. Rose noticed immediately. "You look worried." He forced a smile. "My daughter's starting school tomorrow. I promised I'd be there, but I might get called into work." Rose disappeared briefly into the pantry. She returned, carrying 2 neatly wrapped cinnamon rolls. "One for your daughter, one for you. Tell her someone believes she's going to have a wonderful first day." The mechanic swallowed hard. Nobody in the organization knew he had a daughter. He had kept family separate from mafia business for years. Yet somehow, Mrs. Bellini had remembered. Soon the conversations stretched longer than the meals. Bodyguards who barely exchanged words during security shifts suddenly debated baseball. Drivers shared childhood stories. Gardeners teased accountants. Junior capos listened respectfully to elderly veterans. Arguments that once ended with shouting now dissolved over steaming bowls of homemade pasta. It became impossible to stay angry, while Rose quietly refilled everyone's plates. One evening, 2 soldiers arrived after nearly coming to blows during an operation. The tension between them was obvious. Rose said nothing. She simply placed a large loaf of fresh bread between them. "Could one of you slice this for everyone?" The request seemed almost ridiculous. Yet 5 minutes later, the 2 men were discussing the correct way to cut bread without crushing the crust. By dessert, they were laughing. Neither ever remembered what had caused the original argument. Rose never asked about mafia business. never questioned operations, never offered opinions on power or strategy. She understood that world belonged to Vincent. Her world was different. It consisted of empty chairs that deserved to be filled, hungry people who deserved warm food, and lonely hearts that deserved a little kindness. Ironically, that quiet philosophy accomplished something violence never had. The Bellini estate became calmer. Even productivity improved. Drivers volunteered for extra shifts without complaint. Guards covered one another during emergencies. Maintenance requests finished faster. The chefs noticed leftovers decreasing because employees no longer skipped meals during stressful weeks. No one connected these changes to Rose. At least, not officially. One rainy evening, an elite bodyguard arrived carrying a birthday cake from a nearby bakery. Rose looked surprised. "Whose birthday is it?" "Yours." She laughed. "My birthday was yesterday." "We know. You forgot, because you spent all day helping everyone else." More than 20 employees crowded into the kitchen. Someone found candles. Someone began singing slightly off-key. For perhaps the first time since marrying into the Bellini family, Rose cried. Not because of sadness, because she finally felt included. The nickname appeared almost by accident. An older Sicilian capo finished dinner one night and watched Rose wrap extra food for a guard working the midnight gate. He smiled. "You remind me of my mother." Rose laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." He nodded thoughtfully. "No, you remind all of us." The next evening he entered the kitchen carrying empty containers. "Evening, Mama Rose?" Everyone paused. The words felt strangely natural. Within days, the nickname spread through the estate. Not Mrs. Bellini, not Madam, not Boss's wife. Mama Rose. Not because she was old. Not because she had children, because she somehow cared for everyone, as though they already belonged. The title carried enormous respect. Among hardened mafia men, it was perhaps the greatest compliment anyone could receive. The remarkable part was how fiercely everyone protected the secret. One junior guard accidentally mentioned the evening meals while speaking near Vincent's office. 3 older soldiers nearly dragged him away before he finished the sentence. "Keep your voice down." "What? You don't talk about Mama Rose." "Why not? What if the boss shuts it down?" The young recruit frowned. Why would he? Nobody had an answer. Only fear. Rose's kitchen had become too precious to risk. Vincent valued order, schedules, security. If he believed dozens of armed men gathered unofficially every night, he might forbid it immediately. No one wanted to gamble with that possibility. So they made an unspoken agreement. Protect Mama Rose. Protect the kitchen. Protect the only place inside the estate that still felt like home. Even Vincent noticed subtle improvements around the mansion. Reports arrived earlier. Conflicts decreased. Employee turnover quietly dropped. The atmosphere seemed lighter. One afternoon he mentioned it during a meeting. "I haven't approved any morale initiatives." His chief financial officer shook his head. "No, boss." "Then why does everyone seem happier lately?" The room became strangely quiet. Several capos exchanged nervous glances. One cleared his throat. "We've all adjusted." Vincent accepted the explanation. He had larger concerns demanding his attention. Expanding territories, negotiating alliances, avoiding a potential conflict with a rival family. He never suspected that the strongest force improving his organization wasn't strategy. It wasn't fear. It wasn't money. It was a woman gently asking exhausted men whether they'd eaten enough. Only one person finally noticed the growing pattern. Vivian Moretti. She had spent decades managing every detail inside the Bellini estate. Nothing escaped her attention for long. One evening, while reviewing household expenses, she frowned. The kitchen inventory didn't make sense. Bread consumption had nearly doubled. Fresh herbs disappeared faster every week. Chicken stock orders had increased significantly. Yet official banquet schedules remained unchanged. Vivian closed the ledger. Her instincts sharpened. Someone was using the kitchens without her permission, and she intended to discover exactly who. Vivian Moretti had built her reputation on one principle. Nothing happened inside the Bellini estate without her knowing. For nearly 20 years, she had managed every banquet, every guest list, every household expense, and every member of the domestic staff with unwavering precision. So when the kitchen inventory no longer matched the official records, she knew someone was breaking her rules. She simply didn't expect the culprit to be Rose. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Vivian followed a young pantry assistant carrying 2 baskets of fresh bread toward the old service wing. Instead of entering the main dining hall, he disappeared through a narrow hallway leading to the forgotten kitchen. She stopped outside the door. Voices drifted into the corridor. Not shouting, laughing, real laughter. The kind she hadn't heard inside the mansion in years. Vivian slowly pushed the door open. The sight before her froze her in place. Nearly 30 people filled the small kitchen. Drivers, mechanics, gardeners, bodyguards, junior capos, even 2 senior enforcers whose names were known throughout New York. They sat shoulder to shoulder around mismatched tables. No rank, no hierarchy, no fear, only warm food and relaxed conversation. At the center stood Rose, her sleeves rolled up. A faint streak of flour rested on one cheek. She was serving homemade lasagna while asking one soldier how his mother's surgery had gone. Another thanked her for remembering his son's graduation. Someone else proudly showed pictures of a newborn granddaughter. Rose celebrated every story as though each one belonged to her own family. For several long seconds, nobody noticed Vivian standing in the doorway. Then silence swept across the room. Every chair scraped against the floor. The soldiers rose instinctively, not because Vivian had earned that respect, because they feared what she might do next. Vivian's expression hardened. So, this is where our missing food has been going. Nobody answered. She looked directly at Rose. I specifically instructed the staff that the Bellini kitchens were not to become a public cafeteria. Rose calmly placed the serving spoon onto the counter. I'm sorry. I didn't intend to create a problem. A problem. Vivian laughed coldly. You've turned the boss's residence into a servant's dining hall. The words hung heavily in the room. Several soldiers lowered their heads. Not out of shame for themselves, out of shame for Rose. One veteran stepped forward. Lady Vivian, we asked Mrs. Bellini to cook. Vivian cut him off immediately. I wasn't speaking to you. Her attention returned to Rose. A Bellini wife hosts dignitaries. She represents power. She does not spend evenings feeding guards. Rose answered softly. They were hungry. Vivian's smile became even thinner. That isn't your responsibility. No, Rose admitted. It wasn't. I simply thought someone should care. For the briefest moment, even Vivian had no reply. Then pride returned. Kindness without dignity becomes servitude. You are behaving like hired staff. The insult landed with deliberate precision. Every person in the room felt it. Rose did too. Yet she neither defended herself nor argued. She simply nodded once. I understand. The annual Bellini family dinner took place 3 nights later. Relatives from across the country filled the grand dining hall. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath enormous chandeliers. Professional chefs presented course after course with flawless timing. Everything looked magnificent. Nothing felt warm. Halfway through the evening, Vivian deliberately raised the subject. Our dear Rose has discovered a fascinating new hobby. Several relatives looked toward her. She spends her evenings cooking for security guards. A few guests chuckled politely. One elderly cousin raised an eyebrow. For the guards? Vivian nodded. Apparently, she believes that's an appropriate use of the Bellini name. Several uncomfortable whispers spread around the table. Rose quietly placed her fork down. She wasn't embarrassed by cooking. She was saddened by the way kindness had become something people mocked. Vincent glanced toward his wife. "You've been cooking?" Rose smiled gently. "A little." He looked genuinely confused. "You never mentioned it. You were busy." That simple answer unsettled him more than he expected. Before he could ask another question, Vivian continued, "I've already corrected the situation. The estate must maintain standards." Rose offered no defense. No explanation. No complaint. She simply finished her tea in silence. The following evening, the light beneath the little kitchen window never turned on. The soldiers waited anyway. 5 minutes. 10. 30. No one came. Eventually, the oldest capo quietly knocked on Rose's door. When she answered, she was still wearing an apron. Only, she wasn't cooking. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "I think it's best if I stop." The veteran's shoulders dropped. "We understand." He didn't. None of them did. But they respected her decision. That night, everyone returned to the official dining hall. The food remained perfect. No one finished their meal. Within days, the Bellini estate began changing again. Only this time, in the opposite direction. The mechanics returned to eating alone. Drivers grabbed sandwiches and hurried back to work without conversation. Bodyguards once again stood silently at opposite ends of the security office. The laughter disappeared. Birthdays passed unnoticed. Coffee breaks ended after only a few minutes. The atmosphere felt colder than anyone remembered. No one argued. No one smiled either. The mansion had regained its efficiency, and somehow lost its heart. Vincent noticed first, during his weekly security briefing. The reports were correct. Operations remained successful. Yet something felt wrong. His chief of security answered every question with mechanical precision. Normally there would have been jokes, suggestions, friendly disagreements. Now there was only silence. After the meeting, Vincent stopped Marco in the hallway. "You seem tired." Marco forced a smile. "I'm fine, boss. You've said 3 words in the last hour." Marco looked away. "We're just working. We're just working." Vincent frowned. That wasn't an answer. Over the next several days, he observed more changes. The gardeners no longer sang while trimming the hedges. Kitchen staff hurried through their work with unusual tension. Even the estate dogs wandered toward the dark service kitchen each evening before eventually lying down outside its locked door. One night, Vincent passed the corridor himself. He noticed the small kitchen sitting in complete darkness. For reasons he couldn't explain, the empty room bothered him. Finally, during a late-night patrol review, he overheard 2 young recruits speaking quietly. "I miss Mama Rose." "So do I." "You think she'll ever cook again?" "I don't know. I just know this place doesn't feel like home anymore." Vincent stopped walking. The recruits immediately straightened. Neither realized their boss had heard every word. Vincent spoke calmly. "Who is Mama Rose?" Neither man answered. Fear spread across both faces. Vincent had commanded armies, negotiated with politicians, broken rival organizations. Yet somehow, 2 hardened recruits looked more frightened by that simple question than by any battlefield they had ever entered. At that moment, Vincent realized there was an entire part of his own household that he had never truly seen. Vincent Bellini had built his empire by learning one lesson before all others. People lied. Fear made them lie. Money made them lie. Ambition made them lie. But grief almost never did. The following morning, he asked the oldest veteran in the organization to meet him privately. The man entered Vincent's office with the calm confidence of someone who had survived 3 decades inside the mafia. He expected questions about security. Instead, Vincent asked only one: "Who is Mama Rose?" The veteran lowered his eyes. For several seconds he remained silent. Then he smiled. "Your wife." Vincent frowned. "I know she's my wife. I don't know why everyone calls her that." The veteran took a slow breath. "Boss, Mrs. Bellini never cooked because anyone ordered her to." He paused before continuing. "She cooked because she remembered birthdays. She knew whose parents had passed away. She knew which men secretly sent money home. She noticed who pretended not to be hurting." His voice softened. "Most of us forgot what it felt like to be cared for. She reminded us." Silence settled across the office. It was heavier than any confession Vincent had ever heard. Over the next 3 days, Vincent quietly spoke with employee after employee, not in groups, one at a time. He wanted separate stories. If they all sounded the same, perhaps sentiment had exaggerated the truth. Instead, every conversation revealed something new. Marco remembered arriving home after emergency surgery to find homemade soup waiting at his door with a handwritten note that simply read, "Recovery counts as work too." The mechanic described how Rose had secretly repaired his daughter's old bicycle by paying a local shop after overhearing a single conversation. An accountant admitted she had prepared sugar-free desserts every Friday after discovering he had recently been diagnosed with diabetes. A gardener smiled while recalling how Rose had spent an afternoon planting herbs beside the kitchen window because she wanted everyone to enjoy their fragrance when walking past. No one spoke about expensive gifts. No one mentioned grand gestures. Every story involved something small, something thoughtful, something deeply personal. Each ended exactly the same way. She never wanted recognition. Vincent leaned back in his chair after the final conversation. For years, he had believed loyalty could be purchased through generous salaries, maintained through discipline, protected through fear. Yet his wife had inspired something entirely different. People followed Vincent because they respected his strength. They loved Rose because she saw their humanity. For the first time since inheriting the Bellini syndicate, Vincent realized there was a form of leadership he had never understood. That realization arrived only days before the Bellini family anniversary banquet. The celebration was the largest gathering of the year. Capos traveled from every region. Business allies filled the ballroom. Politicians, judges, community leaders. Every important figure connected to the Bellini family attended. Rose almost declined the invitation. She no longer felt she belonged. But Vincent personally asked her to join him. His voice carried unusual warmth. "It would mean a great deal to me." She smiled gently. "Of course." The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. An orchestra played softly, while servers carried silver trays between elegant tables. Everything reflected prestige. Everything reflected power. Rose wore a simple, deep blue gown. She never tried to outshine anyone. Even so, many employees smiled the moment they saw her. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Others simply looked relieved she had come. Vivian noticed every glance. Her irritation quietly returned. As dessert was served, she rose to address the room. "Before tonight concludes," she announced elegantly, "I'd like to thank everyone who continues preserving the traditions that made the Bellini name respected." Polite applause followed. Then her eyes drifted toward Rose. Of course, good intentions alone are never enough. A great family is built through dignity, not by serving meals to guards. A few uneasy chuckles echoed through the hall. Most people remained silent. Rose lowered her eyes. She had grown accustomed to Vivian's criticism. She expected Vincent to remain silent as he always had. Instead, his chair moved. Slowly, The sound echoed throughout the ballroom. Vincent Bellini stood. Every conversation stopped. He rarely spoke without purpose. When he finally did, his voice remained calm. "I have one question." He looked across the enormous hall. "Everyone who has ever been cared for by my wife, please stand." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Marco rose. Beside him stood the elderly veteran. A mechanic followed. Then another. Drivers, gardeners, housekeepers, kitchen assistants, bodyguards, junior capos, senior capos, family advisors, even several respected allies who quietly admitted Rose had once comforted them after difficult meetings. Chair after chair slid backward. The movement spread across the ballroom like a rising tide. Within seconds, nearly the entire room stood. Only one chair remained occupied. Vivian's. She looked around in stunned disbelief. Not because people obeyed Vincent, because they would have stood, even if he had never asked. Rose covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. She hadn't realized. Anyone remembered. Vincent walked across the ballroom until he stood before his wife. Without speaking, he gently took her hand. His expression carried no embarrassment, only admiration. "I believed power held this empire together." He looked around the room. "I was wrong." His gaze returned to Rose. "You accomplished something I never could. You earned loyalty without fear. You built trust without demanding it. You gave this family something money cannot buy." His voice softened. "You gave us a home." The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Heartfelt applause. Heartfelt applause. Someone near the back spoke the words everyone had hidden for months. "Mama Rose." Another voice repeated them. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom echoed with the same title. "Mama Rose, Mama Rose, Mama Rose." It was not a joke. It was not a nickname. It was the highest honor those hardened men knew how to give. Rose smiled through tears. For the first time since entering the Bellini family, she finally believed she belonged there. In the weeks that followed, change came naturally. Vivian requested a private meeting with Rose. There were no witnesses, no audience, only two women seated across from one another. "I judged you by appearances," Vivian admitted quietly. "I believed strength looked a certain way." She lowered her head. "I was mistaken." Rose reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "We all learn differently. No anger, no revenge, only grace." Within a month, Vivian stepped away from managing the estate, recommending younger staff members continue her work with greater openness than she herself had shown. Vincent made changes of his own. An unused wing of the mansion was transformed into a permanent family dining hall. Not a luxurious banquet room, a welcoming place filled with long wooden tables, warm lighting, and an open kitchen where anyone, from the newest recruit to the oldest capo, could share a meal together. Rose insisted the doors remain open to everyone. Vincent never argued. He had learned that some decisions belonged to the true heart of the household. Several months later, a nervous young recruit entered the dining hall for the first time. He watched battle-hardened veterans laughing over homemade bread, while Rose moved between tables carrying bowls of steaming soup. Confused, he whispered to an older capo, "Why does everyone smile whenever Mrs. Bellini walks in?" The capo looked toward Vincent, who was quietly helping Rose carry fresh dishes to the table. Then he smiled. "Boss Vincent built the strongest empire in America." He nodded toward Rose. "But Mrs. Bellini built the family that keeps it standing." Vincent overheard every word. Without hesitation, he wrapped one arm proudly around his wife's shoulders. Then, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said, And that's why every empire needs a queen. The room filled with warm laughter. Rose looked around the table. Soldiers, servants, advisors, friends, family. People who once shared nothing except fear, now shared stories, meals, birthdays, and hope. Her grandfather had been right all along. Every great meal began by making people feel seen. And in the end, the most feared mafia boss in America discovered that the greatest strength inside his empire had never been power, wealth, or intimidation. It had always been the quiet love of the plus-size woman everyone once underestimated.